So I'm going to introduce our keynote and guest speaker for this afternoon, Bo Stråth, who was a distinguished professor from the Finnish Academy and a director of research at the Department of World Cultures, the Center of Nordic Studies at the University of Helsinki. And is going today to speak to us, to share his thoughts about the changing preconditions of knowledge production from the Humboldt University to the Market University. So the floor is yours, Bo, and you can start.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I will begin with critical theory because critique, I think, is in our academic DNA, and the historical point of reference is Kant, of course. Kant argued that there was no real knowledge if one couldn't test it through critical questions in a free public debate. There was a connection between critique and power in his view. The critique scrutinized and questioned power. Marx argued against Kant that things were more complicated. Power influenced reason and our ways to reflect. Reason and critique were part of a power game. There was no external independent viewpoint from which critique could be exerted. There was the dimension of ideology in the critique. His ideology he called science, as we know. Adorno wrote after Holocaust. He doubted not only authority, but also reason. There is no reason-driven progress anymore, he said. Only the end of progress is progress, he said in a famous aphorism. The idea of critique is, as I said, in our academic DNA. It is easy to talk about how crucial criticism is, but the deeper you go into the question, the more you see how conditional the critique is. There is no pure reason and no pure critique. This human condition does not mean that critique is impossible, but that it is preliminary and that one can contest it all the time. Critique begins as heterodoxy against orthodoxy. This is the traditional way in the university system since the medieval time. However, the heterodoxy becomes new orthodoxy when it has broken through. And the new orthodoxy, in turn, is challenged by new heterodoxies. Critique is a permanent challenge, a permanent resistance, an attitude that will never lead to lasting stability guaranteed by reason. Here, one could refer to Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe, where he saw the Enlightenment project as a human achievement available for all peoples. The Enlightenment ideals can be used against the colonizers through its invitation to critique and protest, as Chakrabarty phrased it. Critique as permanent questioning and protest from preliminary positions with imperfect outcomes and shortcomings seems to be a more realistic view on Kant's ideal type and how we can use his philosophy. Instead of knowledge in a more or less absolute sense, one might talk about knowledge regimes mixed with a degree of ideology. Research legitimizes politics, and politics orientates research through its demand for legitimization. Academic knowledge, I think here on social sciences, knowledge writ large, is entangled with ideology and power, irrespective whether it is confirming or criticizing the power. I will, in this presentation in particular, refer to two such knowledge regimes, Keynesianism and neoliberalism. We must, against the backdrop of what I have said, connect Kant to Foucault and cope with the tension between them. The tension between reason and ideological power as the point of departure for our critical work. Foucault talked about heavy knowledge epistemes that imposed themselves and set the framework for what one can say and do. The indoctrination of the epistemes through strong social institutions. He talked about the church, the schools, the army, and the prisons that discipline populations, which regularly, but not necessarily often, provoked protests and attempts to escape the impositions. Knowledge is as little as reason pure. Knowledge is power with a dimension of ideology. This we learn from Foucault, and this we have to connect to what Kant said. Wilhelm von Humboldt established the first modern university in 1810 in Berlin. The production of knowledge requires organization. This was his insight, and organization of a new kind compared to the medieval universities. He built it on the thought that knowledge requires both research and teaching. Research and teaching reinforced each other in mutually ways. Knowledge was not only a matter of production, it dealt with dissemination and management of production. The free and critical research Humboldt did not know about, neither about Marx nor about Adorno's reservations. The free and critical research was used for the teaching of students, for professions, and in an expanding state apparatus. The state, the government, thus had an interest in what came out of the research-based teaching. The state financed free and critical thinking. This was the connection to Kant, which, as we have seen, was less free and critical than what Kant and Humboldt imagined. One must make one important reservation here. This model, the Humboldt University, was less based on Humboldt's thought at the beginning of the 19th century than on what the academic political entanglement wanted at the turn of the century 1900 to cope with the emerging organized capitalism and organized labor, which required a new moderating task of the state. The Humboldt University idea was an ideal type from the past, mobilized in order to cope with the more turbulent time during the decades before World War I. After 1945, democratic mass societies emerged. The mutually reinforcing dynamics between mass consumption and mass production drove them. The connection between research and teaching became less tight. A certain division of labor between researchers and teachers emerged, but the state continued to finance the universities and the research, which became more concentrated in specific research institutions and centers. The state wanted in particular social science research about the preconditions of the welfare states and how to make them sustainable. A separation between applied and basic research emerged. Of course, in practice, applied and basic were mixed up, but something happened when the research became more targeted towards the question of how to maintain and sustain the welfare states. This research agenda resulted in the Keynesian knowledge regime. University education for broader social strata led to the concentration of teaching and research in campuses of a new kind. The master narrative that legitimized this knowledge regime was about modernization and development. The narrative described a progressive story for the Western world, defying Adorno's doubts about progress. The underdeveloped countries would develop through decolonization and development aid. This story's critical corrective was the dependency theory, with the argument that decolonization was neocolonization, when a new kind of globally operating transnational or multinational corporations, TNCs and MNCs, penetrated the former colonies. There was a tension in the narrative and the knowledge regime when it addressed the third world. But this tension between development and dependency did not disturb the overall story about progress. It only made it more complex. In the industrialized Western part of the rich North, social reform and welfare were key dimensions of the modernization. At the end of the 1960s, strains emerged in the performance of the model. Many dreamt of permanent affluence ahead, which on the other side activated the conflict of distribution and brought a general radicalization. 1968 was a new kind of global social protest, which went beyond the conflict of distribution. It was also a generational conflict with emancipation from historical ties around the family, for instance. It was a protest against hierarchies. On this latter point, the neoliberals would tap in. Then came the crisis of the 1970s. In 1971, the dollar collapsed. The printing of more dollars for financing the Vietnam War in particular, and the Cold War more generally, deflated the dollar, which failed to maintain its gold commitment. In 1973, all currencies were floating. The dollar lost its value, and this became a problem for those who made trades in dollars. And among those were the oil producers. And they decided to react to the sinking dollar prices in the autumn of 1973, with a shock increase of the oil prices on the world markets. And in a few months, the prices were 4 times as high as they had been in October 1973. And this led to a crisis in the industrial north, collapse of key industries, shipbuilding, steel industries, and in the next round, mass unemployment occurred. And many saw the 1930s coming back. It was just one generation after the 1930s. Today, it's much more distant, but in those days, they really saw the specter haunting Europe again. And the reaction was massive state subsidies, which in turn led to massive state debts and high inflation. And this was a totally unknown phenomenon in the Keynesian knowledge paradigm. There was a name for it, stagflation, high inflation and mass unemployment. In Keynes' theory, there couldn't be both at the same time. The crisis was not a demand crisis as Keynes' theory built on, but it was a structural crisis that hit the core of the heart of the industrial north was the oil, of course, and this was why it was so dramatic. In the poor south, the idea spread that one could use the oil as an example for other raw materials, a shock increases of the prices. And then at the end, the third world could stand up and improve the terms of trade. And this was what happened, the third world, the G77, as they also called themselves, they called for a new international economic order, using the United Nations as a framework for their protests. It was a radical program with possibilities to nationalize the foreign capital investments in their countries and many other, the massive redistribution. They had a full program. And the Keynesian connection to development collapsed, like the Keynesian theory. The French philosophers Jean-François Lyotard and Jacques Derrida commented on the crisis of Keynes and the modernization's narrative from other perspectives. The point of departure of Lyotard was the computerization, the digital technology. In 1979, he published The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge. It was written on the demand of from the universities in Quebec. Derrida developed ideas about deconstruction, but I do not go into them here. But Lyotard is of interest for us. In postmodernity, the era of computerized knowledge, he argued that there is no master narrative any longer. No teleology is possible. Knowledge is fragmentation, and it fragments into language games. And this idea he took from Wittgenstein, and the idea of fragmentation was a frontal attack on Habermas with his communicational consensus communities. Language games are unstable, he said. Taking of tricks. They were driven by taking of tricks, trumping of a communicational adversary. They were performative speech acts. What you say is also doing something. And he said, furthermore, language games operate with paralogy. And this, as you know, paralogy, fallacious arguments and illogical conclusions in performative speech acts. Legitimation by paralogy was also something which Lyotard argued. Are all scientific knowledge is narrated knowledge. And you see here several of these points is really as a kind of prophecy of the Trumpian world with the language game, which played by taking of tricks and trumping of adversaries and so on. The book was published at the time when neoliberalism was about to supersede Keynesianism. They did indeed have a new master narrative about the market. In 1990s, globalized, and under the globalization narrative became the major new master narrative. So one can say can one then say that Lyotard was wrong? I'm not sure one can. How is it today? There is no new master narrative since 2008, 2010. Nationalism, populism, no master narrative. There is protest. International lawyers talk about the regimes of special areas, the health regime, the social regime, the labor regime, the environment regime. And the question is, who defines the problem? Is the coal pollution, for instance, is it a labor problem with unemployment if you close the plant? Is it a health problem if you continue? Is it an environment problem? This is a matter of power, and this is how you see that the knowledge society breaks down breaks down into fragmented specialist regimes, special regimes, and full of power implications. Neoliberals, the neoliberal agenda, they tried to put the trade regime as a kind of regime of regimes, but they failed. because you cannot trade, make the free trade if you dump. Social dumping is not possible to combine with free trade. So this is also trade. The trade regime is one of those in the game. It's not the superior regime that the neoliberals wanted to make it to. But I think what we see here, this world of special fields, regimes in special fields, is exactly what Lyotard talked about when he talked about the fragmentation of knowledge. Read what he says here. You can see it. I think it's big enough. Yes, that's fine. He discerns basically two alternative uses of the digitalized technology. The one was the imposition of power, the control of big data from above, regulating the market systems. And the other one was the bottom-up use of the big data for emancipative bottom-up struggles. There is a core of this, of course, still there, but it is much more complicated today. But what did he mean by controlling and regulating the market system? Is it the market which is controlling the state, or is it the state which is controlling the market? He doesn't really speak up on this point. And what has happened is probably, one might say, that the market system controls the political system, the state. And he doesn't talk about, I mean, the bottom-up emancipating struggle for through big data. What about the emotions in the social media? The ugly debates, the flooding of emotions which silence reasons, the faked and alternative facts debates, and so on. So this is also there more complicated, but I think, but there is something, is a visionary view, and now after almost 50 years, 40 years later, we see that many of much of what he said there is still with us. The neoliberal knowledge regime. It broke through in the 1990s, but it began to expand in the 1980s after the collapse of the Keynesian regime. Management capacity began to define the criteria of academic leadership rather than intellectual achievements. Thatcher said in a well-known statement that continue to the academia, continue to think free, but get the money for it yourself. The state and the public was no longer prepared to pay for the critical scrutiny of power. And this change of the preconditions required new capacities compared to the free state-sponsored thinking. Capacities to sell the knowledge, to marketize it. Two conceptual moves accompanied the neoliberal breakthrough. The one was the neoliberal discourse that redefined reform from its historical meaning of social reform to connoting economic efficiency, emptied from its social connotation. And the second move shifted government to governance, state and centralized hierarchy to decentralized networking, supporting the market forces. One significant state capacity during Keynesianism was the organization of the top-down redistribution from rich to poor. That capacity disappeared with these two conceptual moves. The DNA molecule with two spirals modeled the imaginary of the triple helix. The triple helix illustrated a new kind of tripartite market corporatism between business capital, the state, and the academia. It replaced the corporatism, the post-war Keynesian tripartite neo-corporatist entanglement around the labor market, where the employers, the trade unions, and the state negotiated economic performance and distributed the yields. The marketization of knowledge and knowledge production meant that the state focused on strengthening the competitive power of capital, withdrawing from welfare provision. The government supported a privatization drive, which also involved the universities. The research too was mobilized for the reinforcement and legitimization of market power. The research was an investment in the future. This was nothing new, but became perverted when the research and investment were not for the public good, but individual success. A new kind of evaluation industry has accompanied the marketization of economic knowledge production. As academics, we are in one of two roles. The one is to be being evaluators, and the other is being evaluated. And we shift between these two roles. There is a paradox in the competition for competitiveness. Everybody wants to follow the most successful. Competition is not about differences, but about setting the standards. The language of benchmarking and best practices accompanied this development in the European research area. It leads to concentration and standardization instead of decentralization and diversity. Odd and small disciplines and topics disappear from the research agenda. Evaluation is the quantification of quality. A case in point is the quotation indexes and the counting of publications, which fail to demonstrate the connection to quality. Look on all these indexes, references in self-referential networks, for instance, which give high figures or high ranks. So now I come at the end to what to do. I will say a few words about the planetary knowledge regime. I would discuss how to work on a new knowledge regime and a new ideology, and how one could work on overcoming fragmentation without becoming totalizing through new forms of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. There is a tension between fragmentation and totalizing ambitions. The master narrative is totalizing. Look back on the globalization narrative when everything was market. So this is a problem, I think, but fragmentation is also a problem, as we have seen. So I think it is, the question is how to get some balance between these two. The planetary perspective. The neoliberal globalization narrative built up historical continuity with the 19th century, framed as a prosperous period of free trade and capitalist expansion. The historical practices of colonialism and imperialism disappeared from view. The history of the term global connotes empires, capitalism, and technology in the framework of an evolving Western modernizing, civilizing, and colonizing project, supported by the development of navigation and communication technologies. The globalization perspective is deeply embedded in the liberal and Eurocentric 19th century narrative on capitalism and democracy, and their purportedly mutually reinforcing dynamics. The history of belief in progress, growth, and expansion nurtured the globalization perspective. This is from where we come. Paradoxically, the expansive exploration of the world contained the germ of its shrinking in another sense than what the population growth and digital communication technology have done. Hannah Arendt commented on this other sense against the backdrop of the Soviets' Sputnik launch in 1957, which signaled that space was the next step for human expansion. Humans now lived in an earth-wide continuous whole visible from without, she wrote. She did not comment on it, but it seems clear that there couldn't be a Western center in the view of the planet Earth from space. And in the perspective of the infinite universe, terra was finite. Nothing, to be sure, Hannah Arendt said, could have been more alien to the purpose of the explorers and the circumnavigators of the early modern age than this closing in process. They went to enlarge the earth, not to shrink her into a ball. As Deepesh Chakrabarty has argued, this development of expansive shrinking leaves humans with two options. Either feeling homeless as nobody feels at home and identifies with the planet as an entity, or working towards a unity in which all humans come to identify with the planet as their home, by implication transcending racial, ethnic, religious, and class demarcations, all potentially xenophobic. As opposed to the globalization perspective of endlessness, the planetary perspective presents an alternative view, conceiving the world as bounded and needing political coordination. The planetary imaginary emphasizes the finiteness of resources on Earth and the need for their distribution on a planetary scale. The practice is legitimized by the neoliberal knowledge regime that grew up around the globalization narrative about an endless market, where the invisible hand-created order led to growing cleavages between rich and poor, through what was in effect a bottom-up redistribution of resources from the poor to the rich. We need to go back a bit in history to see how to get out of the present situation, the neoliberal cul-de-sac. There are many references to return to, but I will mention two here. Gunnar Myrdal insisted that economics is a social science and not the superior master of social sciences. Edmund Husserl in the 1930s wrote about the crisis of European science. Science had developed from being an observer of nature, adapting to it, to a manipulator of nature with catastrophic consequences for moral philosophy and natural sciences. We know the results of the crisis Husserl observed. He didn't live to see them appear. The modern transport technology working for the deportations to Auschwitz and the bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A planetary perspective's crucial innovation would be establishing a knowledge regime that integrates and entangles ecological and economic theories, connecting them to anthropological, philosophical, and normative reflection on planetary justice and human recognition and responsibility. There is no final solution. There is continuous critique and crisis dynamics, continuous heterodox challenges of orthodoxy, continuous protest. This is a Kant's heritage. There's no end goal in Kant's philosophy. It's a continuous activity. And Chakrabarty about the Enlightenment heritage to learn protest through. This perspective is tentative and it is preliminary. There's no equilibrium for more extended periods. And there is a tension between language games and master narratives. It is important to avoid a collapse into fragmentation, but it is important to have a critical view on master narratives. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for your very stimulating presentation. Very interesting to be aware that no solutions are here in front of us. So it's a doorway to alternatives and to think about alternatives. And I think it's a good food for thought also in what we are doing in this program and in this workshop. Thank you for that.